They thought they forced me out quietly, but they didn't read what I slipped beneath the resignation page. By the time they realized, their signatures had already sealed their downfall. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. The email came just before lunch. Subject line simple and sterile. Quick touch point. I knew before I clicked it. I knew, by the way, my manager avoided my eyes in the break room, by the sudden silence that fell when I walked past the glass conference rooms, by the way HR had been unusually kind to me all week, offering empty smiles and one too many offers to chat. Still, I opened it. A calendar invite. Private room. No agenda. I clicked accept and finished my coffee, slowly, deliberately, letting the bitterness coat my tongue while I steadied my breath. When the time came, I walked down the hall past familiar desks and coworkers who now looked at their screens a little too hard. The meeting room was small, fluorescent-lit, windowless. Inside, my manager sat stiffly in his tailored suit, the HR rep beside him already holding a folder. They didn't waste time. It was rehearsed. They thanked me for my contributions and told me it was time for a transition, using every corporate euphemism they could conjure to avoid saying what they meant. They were forcing me out. My manager shifted uncomfortably when I looked at him, pretending this wasn't personal, pretending we hadn't just had drinks last Friday where he praised my strategic mind. The HR woman slid the folder across the table like a menu. Inside was a resignation letter already typed up with my name, date, and an open space for my signature. She explained that signing would look better than termination and would help me move on with dignity. My chest burned, but I kept my face still. No tears, no questions. I smiled, just slightly, and said nothing. I picked up the pen, skimmed the words again, and nodded. I asked if I could take a moment outside to review. They agreed, a little too quickly, relieved at my calm. What they didn't notice was the second page I slipped beneath the resignation letter as I stepped into the hallway. A single sheet. A legal addendum I drafted the night I overheard them plotting this. The night I forwarded emails to my personal account and printed out everything I would need. The addendum included a clause waiving my non-disclosure under whistleblower protections, a declaration that I retained authorship of all original research produced during my tenure, and a small line at the bottom, confirming that by signing, they acknowledged all attached terms. I returned, stacked the papers carefully, signed the top sheet, and slid it back across the table. My manager signed next, then HR. No one flipped the page, no one looked twice. I stood, shook their hands with the same forced politeness they had shown me, and walked out with the weight of rage pressed into the back of my throat, but also something else, something sharp and steady. They thought they had ended something today, but all they had done was sign the beginning. The door clicked shut behind me with a finality that felt louder than any shouting match could, and for a brief moment, I just stood there, alone in the hallway, folder in hand, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted to punch its way out. I could still hear the hum of the overhead lights, the muffled voices of the HR rep, and my manager chatting casually inside as if they had just wrapped up a meeting about supply budgets instead of a career. I walked slowly down the corridor toward the break room, turned the corner where the security camera didn't reach, and opened the folder again. My signature stared back at me, a clean line at the bottom of a page that reeked of condescension. I flipped it once, checked that the second page was still there, perfectly aligned, uncreased, and unmistakably real. My handwriting was small, neat, confident, just as it had always been, and at the very bottom, in print so subtle it might be missed by anyone too arrogant to look, were the words that would change everything. I slid it back into the folder, tucked it under my arm, and walked back toward my desk with my chin high and my pulse steadying with every step. I passed Janine from marketing, who gave me a sympathetic half-smile, probably already aware of what had happened through the grapevine. I gave her nothing back. Not yet. I sat at my desk one last time and looked around at the space I had made my own, the plant by the window, the framed photo of my dog, the drawer with my favorite pens, all of it about to be boxed up and wiped clean like I had never existed here at all. I started packing, slow and methodical, as if I had all the time in the world because I wanted them to watch me. I wanted them to see what grace under pressure actually looked like. I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the hard drive they had forgotten I ever used, the one where I saved everything they asked me to delete, the one that held records and memos and files they thought had vanished. I placed it gently between folders and notebooks, tucked it beneath a stack of innocuous training binders, and sealed the box with the tape HR had provided. I carried it out myself, refusing the help offered by the intern who looked at me like I was being exiled. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was setting something on fire without needing a single match. Outside, the sun hit my face as I stepped through the revolving door, and I didn't look back, not once, because behind me was a company that had mistaken silence for weakness. And ahead of me was a very specific truth wrapped in signatures they never bothered to read. They thought the resignation meant I was finished, but they hadn't read the fine print, and now it belonged to me. The morning after I walked out of that building with a cardboard box and a heart full of unfinished sentences, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold and stared at the document I had crafted weeks ago. The one I had written in the quiet after overhearing a hallway conversation they didn't know I was close enough to catch. It was nothing flashy, just one page of carefully constructed legal language, reviewed by a friend of a friend who practiced employment law and owed me a favor. I had labeled it simply, Addendum A. It outlined 3 things. First, that I retained authorship of an internal white paper I had written 3 months ago detailing a pattern of suspicious accounting practices and discriminatory bonus allocations, both of which I had flagged, submitted, and been told to drop. Second, that by signing the resignation package, all parties acknowledged the inclusion of attached terms and supplemental documents, which meant the moment they signed my resignation letter, they also signed off on my ownership of that document and my release from their NDA under whistleblower protection laws. And third, buried at the very end in clean, legally approved text was the quiet dagger of it all. The moment they terminated my employment by coercion, they forfeited all rights to any intellectual property I had created in my time there that had not been publicly disclosed. The white paper fit that definition perfectly. It had been reviewed by my boss and legal, but never released. They shelved it, pretended it did not exist, and now it was mine. I sat there with my laptop open and the document glowing on the screen, the cursor blinking at the edge of truth they had tried to bury. Every email I had sent to leadership about the discrepancies. Every note they had returned without comment. Every reply that told me to trust the process. I had them all, and with the clause they blindly signed, I had the right to use them. I emailed a copy of the addendum to my attorney with the subject line, "Confirm execution." His reply came within the hour. "It's airtight. You played it perfectly." I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in, let the taste of vindication spread across my tongue like something sweet after years of swallowing dust. They had taken everything they thought mattered to me. The job title, the paycheck, the office with a view I never got to enjoy because I was always covering for someone else's mistake. But they didn't know what I had slipped between the lines. They didn't read past the signature. And now, the truth they tried to shred was sitting safely in my hands. Protected, valid, and finally, undeniably mine. They took the job. I kept the truth. And in the end, it would be the only thing that mattered. I walked into the office one last time under the guise of collecting the rest of my things, a visit that had been scheduled, approved, and politely acknowledged in a cold, automated email from HR that thanked me for my time and reminded me to return all company property. I stepped off the elevator to the familiar sterile scent of printer toner and stale air conditioning and found my desk exactly how I left it. Untouched except for a yellow sticky note someone had left on my monitor that read "Best of luck" with a smiley face that felt more like a smirk. I didn't bother guessing who left it. I had no interest in goodbyes from people who watched it happen and said nothing. I sat down slowly, letting my fingers glide across the surface of the desk I had once poured so many hours into, and began filling the second box. Notebooks, framed photos, a mug I never liked, a cardigan I kept for cold afternoons when the air conditioning made the office feel like a walk-in freezer. I moved carefully, deliberately, Not because I was sentimental, but because I wanted them to see that I wasn't rushing, that I wasn't broken, that I was in control of every breath I took. What they didn't know was that at the bottom of the first box I had already taken home sat the real reason I returned. A single manila folder containing a copy of the internal white paper they refused to acknowledge. The one I had written and submitted months ago and that had mysteriously disappeared from the shared drive. The one I had printed quietly on the day I was pulled into that meeting. It was mine now. Protected by the clause they didn't notice. Shielded by the law they underestimated. And in that folder was the kind of evidence that could undo them if placed in the right hands. I returned my badge at the front desk, gave a polite smile to the intern who avoided eye contact, and made one final pass through the office without speaking. On my way out, I stopped by the break room and left my company-issued mug on the counter without washing it. Not out of spite, but as a reminder. I carried the box with both hands, walking through the lobby with a posture that made it impossible to mistake me for someone defeated. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the wind tugged at my coat as I reached the curb. I turned back once, not to mourn, but to mark the end. I wasn't leaving empty-handed. They had taken my role, my title, my parking spot. But I had taken something far more valuable. I had taken their secret. The one they thought would disappear if they pushed me out quietly. Now it lived in a folder in my apartment, and soon it would speak louder than any promotion they ever dangled in front of me. The text came 2 hours after I walked out of that building for the last time, still in my coat, still holding the box I had not yet unpacked. Standing in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by the strange emptiness that follows a life interruption you saw coming, but still hoped might swerve at the last minute. My phone buzzed against the counter, and when I looked down, it was him, my former manager. The one who sat across from me in that meeting room with a face carved out of manufactured regret, the one who signed my resignation with the same hand that used to write "good job" on the corner of my reports. His message read, "Hope there are no hard feelings, just business, no greeting, no punctuation beyond that single period." I stared at the words and let them soak in like poison that had finally identified itself. Just business. As if stripping me of the work I built, the hours I gave, the dignity I held through their missteps, could be reduced to a simple line in a profit and loss statement. I did not reply. Not because I did not have words. I had plenty, but none of them were worth handing over to a man who thought his casual betrayal could be softened with a text. Instead, I let the message sit there like a paperweight on the hour that had just passed, then turned my phone face down and went to the box. I pulled out the folder, the real one. The one with copies of everything, dates, timestamps, financial breakdowns, the internal report that had been deemed too damaging to publish, the bonus discrepancy spreadsheet they said did not exist, the emails that showed how they inflated client metrics to secure investment. All of it right where it had been for months, gathering dust while I sat through meetings where they smiled and lied and told me to stay in my lane. My lane was paved in silence, but not anymore. I poured a glass of wine, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. In one window, I pulled up the document. In another, I opened a new email draft. I typed no subject, no recipient. Not yet. Just stared at the cursor and let it blink back at me like it was daring me to move. He thought I walked away. He thought he won, but he did not know what I carried out under his nose. The text was still sitting unread, but I did not need to open it again to remember what it said. Just business. If that was the game, then I was finally ready to play. Only this time, I was not walking into meetings blind. I was not asking for a seat at their table. I was building my own. And soon, he would understand what it really meant to sign something without reading what came attached. I had titled it carefully, choosing a name that sounded boring enough to be ignored by executives skimming through reports, but meaningful enough for me to find quickly if it ever became necessary to pull it back into the light. It sat quietly on the drive for weeks, untouched, unopened, buried under layers of more urgent presentations and flashy internal memos written by people who wanted credit for ideas they never fully understood. The file was mine, built from months of analysis, screenshots, financial statements. and quietly collected testimonies from lower-level employees who knew something was wrong but feared the cost of speaking up. It started with the bonuses. Small things, discrepancies in who received them and when. The patterns were impossible to ignore once I saw them laid out side by side. Men with less experience were rewarded for projects they barely touched, while women who carried entire campaigns were told to wait for the next quarter. Then there were the forged client reports, numbers inflated to paint a rosier picture to shareholders, fabricated engagement metrics, false billing hours, and a pipeline forecast that looked more like a fiction novel than a projection. I compiled it all, triple-checked the data, and presented it to leadership months before I was pushed out. I remember the room, the way my slides clicked forward while eyes glazed over, the way no one asked a single follow-up question. Afterward, my manager pulled me aside and said the timing was not right, that the leadership team had more important priorities. He thanked me for the effort, told me to keep it internal, then nothing. No action, no audit, just silence. And then, gradually, I was pulled off major projects. Invites stopped arriving in my inbox. I was spoken over in meetings I used to lead. I became invisible by design, but I never deleted that file. I backed it up, printed it, protected it with a clause they never bothered to read. And now, it sat open in front of me once again, every chart, every sentence, every footnote intact. I added one more page to it, a summary, one paragraph that tied everything together. And then I saved it under a new name, one that would catch a different kind of attention. I closed the document, encrypted the folder, and prepared the first draft of the email that would send it to someone with the power to make them regret everything they ignored. They thought pushing me out would silence the problem. They thought I would walk away quietly, bruised and grateful to still have my reputation. But they never looked past the cover page. They never saw what I had documented in plain sight. The file they ignored was now the file that would expose them, and I was no longer afraid of being the one who pressed send. I was ready to be the reason they stopped sleeping through their own lies. The office was tucked away on the 10th floor of a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you would never notice unless you were looking for it, which made it perfect for the kind of conversation I was about to have. I had emailed the file 2 days earlier, not to a news outlet, not to a friend, but to a lawyer I had met once at a networking event, someone who gave me his card and said if you ever need to talk about workplace retaliation, I listen first and bill later. I had kept that card in my wallet for a year, never expecting to use it, but the moment I left my job, it was the first thing I reached for. He met me in the lobby with a warm handshake and a knowing look, as if he already understood more than I had written. We sat in a small glass-walled conference room, and I watched him flip through the printed file in silence, his brow furrowed, lips pressed into a line that never quite shifted into surprise. When he reached the last page, the clause they signed without reading, the whistleblower protection, the ownership of intellectual property, he leaned back in his chair and finally looked at me. "This is airtight," he said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the knots in my chest begin to loosen. He walked me through the options, explained the legal path forward, the protections I already had, the ways we could bring this to light without risking my future. I nodded through most of it, taking notes I barely needed because I had already done the research, already imagined every step. What I needed was confirmation that I was not crazy, not paranoid, not reckless. And he gave me that. He called it strategy. He called it leverage. He said most people never think to protect themselves in writing, and that by the time they realize they should have, it is too late. But not for me. I left that meeting with more than just legal clarity. I left with a plan, a timeline, a partner who understood how to turn quiet resistance into real consequence. As I stepped out into the late afternoon sun, I felt taller, not because the burden was gone, but because I finally knew how to carry it. They had tried to gut my career with a smile and a folder. Now, they would learn what it felt like to be undone by the very woman they underestimated. I hailed a cab, opened my phone, and started drafting the message that would light the first fuse. It would not be loud, not yet, but it would reach exactly the right people. The truth was no longer something I was sitting on. It was something I was preparing to launch. And thanks to one overlooked clause and one very good lawyer, it was already too late for them to take it back. I sat at my kitchen counter that night with my laptop open, the glow from the screen casting just enough light to make the room feel like it was holding its breath. And I stared at the draft email I had written over and over in my head long before I ever typed a single word. The subject line was short: "You deserve to know." No caps, no dramatic punctuation, just a sentence that sounded almost too gentle for what was attached. The recipient list included only 3 names, each one tied to millions of dollars in investment, and the kind of power that kept the company breathing even as it rotted from within. These were not press contacts or friends. These were the people the executive team pretended to laugh with while calculating how to manipulate their trust. I copied the link to a secure folder, dropped in the document, the whistleblower clause, the original submission date, and every revision I had written since. I added a single sentence beneath the link. I wrote, "This was buried." I never received a reply. I clicked send without ceremony, without a second read-through, and then closed the laptop as if it had done something sacred. There was no explosion, no dramatic music, no breaking news alert, just stillness. But the kind of stillness you recognize from watching a match land inside a dry forest. It was going to burn. Not right away, not all at once, but inevitably. I made tea and stood by the window while the water boiled, watching the street below like something might change there too. The next morning, I woke to silence. Not from the outside world, but from them. No emails, no texts, no frantic attempts to call me back into the fold. I checked the secure folder and saw that it had been opened, viewed, downloaded, and then I waited. I waited like I had waited in that office, unseen, unheard, forgotten. Only this time, I was the one holding the truth. 2 days passed before I saw the first ripple. One of the board members removed his company affiliation from LinkedIn. Another posted a vague tweet about accountability. Small things, but I knew the sound of pressure building. The kind of pressure they used to place on me behind closed doors, now circling them like smoke under a doorframe. I did not need applause or credit. I needed consequence. I needed them to feel even a fraction of the panic they forced me to swallow while pretending it was professionalism. I reopened the email once, read my own words, and smiled. This was buried. Not anymore. I sipped my tea, calm and certain, and waited for the heat to finally reach the walls they had built so carelessly around their lies. It was no longer my secret to keep. Now, it was their fire to put out. It started quietly, as most implosions do, with whispers behind doors and sudden calendar blocks that appeared on executive schedules with vague titles like Strategic Risk Discussion and Urgent Board Sync. The kind of meetings that don't come with bagels or small talk. I watched from a distance, no longer tethered to their timelines, but still very much aware of the pulse beneath the surface. I had contacts who were still inside, people who once pitied me for being pushed out and now stared at their screens wondering if they were next. The CEO tried to spin the story internally, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of outdated reports, a one-time error in judgment. But screenshots don't lie, and time-stamped spreadsheets are not opinions. The truth had weight, and now it was pressing down on every corner of the boardroom like a roof about to collapse. 3 executives were called into back-to-back meetings, and by the end of the day, one of them had cleared out their desk. No farewell email, no cake, just gone. My name was not mentioned in official memos, but it didn't have to be. I could feel it in the way people looked over their shoulders, the way team leads told their reports to hold off on any big decisions until further notice. I became a shadow in their building, one they could not see but could no longer deny. Investors demanded answers. Auditors were pulled in. The white paper I wrote was being combed through line by line, and every word was backed by their own data, their own signatures, their own silence. The HR director who sat across from me the day I was forced to sign my resignation was now reportedly on leave, a phrase that meant either lawyered up or being shown the exit quietly. My former manager had not posted on social media in days, which for a man who updated his followers about every smoothie and sunset was the loudest silence I had ever heard from him. I sat in my apartment and watched it unfold like a movie I had already seen in my mind, scene for scene, only now it was real and irreversible. They had spent so much time crafting a narrative around control, around hierarchy, around the illusion of stability, and now they were grasping at excuses that did not hold. The board was not interested in apologies, they were interested in protection, and that meant heads would roll. Not mine. I had already been dismissed. Now I was the reason the foundation was cracking. The resignation they forced on me had become the lever I used to expose the rot. And as the calls increased and the faces changed and the panic built, I did not gloat. I did not speak. I simply watched. Because the truth does not need to be loud to tear a building apart. It just needs to be undeniable. The official statement dropped late on a Thursday afternoon, timed perfectly to bury it beneath the noise of the upcoming weekend, as if a few days of silence could cushion the blow or make people forget what they had already begun to whisper about in break rooms and investor threads. It came from the company's communications department, polished and vague, full of words like restructuring and evolving priorities and strengthened oversight, all designed to suggest movement without ever admitting failure, but the timing spoke louder than the language. By the time the memo hit inboxes, 2 executives had quietly disappeared from the leadership page on the company's website, and a third was reassigned to an internal role that did not exist a week earlier. The internal newsletter framed it as a strategic shift to align with the future, but anyone paying attention knew what it really was: damage control. I read the statement 3 times, not because I needed clarity, but because I wanted to see if they would dare distort the truth again. They did not mention the white paper. They did not acknowledge the discrepancies. They did not apologize, but they could not erase what had already been seen, downloaded, and shared. The moment the statement went live, I received a quiet message from a former colleague who had once avoided me in the hall after the day they made me sign. It said, "Thank you. That was all. No elaboration. No signature." But it told me everything. People were waking up. People were noticing. Investors began asking for deeper audits. Department heads were told to pause new initiatives. Every conversation suddenly had a lawyer on copy. I watched all of it unfold from the calm of my apartment, sipping coffee as the empire that once dismissed me tried to rearrange its broken pieces without admitting it had shattered. They had taken everything they thought I cared about: the title, the role, the access. But what they could not take was the evidence, the signature, the clause, the proof. And now, with a single document and the right timing, I had forced a company that prided itself on control to face its own chaos. I did not post about it. I did not need the spotlight. The statement was public, and the silence afterwards said enough. I opened the press release one last time and stared at the line that read, "We remain committed to transparency and accountability." The irony nearly made me laugh, but instead, I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the evening sky shift from soft gray to a deeper blue. Somewhere in that building, someone was packing up their desk. Somewhere else, someone was deleting emails, but none of them could undo what had already begun. The paper they ignored had spoken. The structure they built on arrogance had cracked. And I had done it without raising my voice. Just one sentence. Just one signature. Just one woman they underestimated. The offer came in quietly, tucked between a pile of unread newsletters and spam emails I would have normally deleted without opening, but the subject line caught my eye in a way that made my pulse flicker. It read, "We've been following your story." At first, I thought it was a journalist or maybe a recruiter fishing for attention, but when I clicked it open and read the message, I had to read it again. It was from a firm I had long admired from a distance, one known for doing the kind of work that mattered, one that valued integrity not just as a buzzword, but as a foundation. They said they had seen the recent industry shakeup, heard about the internal review, understood that not everything could be said publicly. They wanted to meet. Just a conversation, they wrote. But I already knew. Something had shifted. The silence around my name was no longer avoidance. It was weight. It was proof. I had become something else. Not the woman who was pushed out, not the one who walked away quietly, but the one who left with the truth and the foresight to protect it. We set up a video call, and when the screen lit up, the woman on the other end smiled like she already knew she would be offering me something more than validation. She asked about my goals, my values, what I wanted to build now that I was no longer tethered to the wreckage of a company that tried to bury me. And for the first time in months, I answered without editing myself. I spoke plainly. I spoke as someone who no longer had to fight to be heard. When the offer came officially, a week later, it included everything they had denied me: a better title, better pay, a seat at the table where decisions were actually made, and something more. My name. On the door, on the deck, on the strategy, no shadows, no permission, just ownership. I accepted it quietly. Not out of modesty, but because this was not about proving anything to them anymore. This was for me, for the woman who wrote the report at midnight with swollen eyes and a locked jaw. For the employee who showed up to meetings knowing she would be ignored. For the voice that was called disruptive when it was really just necessary. I cleaned out the last of my old work files, archived the evidence, and closed the chapter not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of peace. They had tried to erase me, and in doing so, they sharpened me. They had given me every reason to fold, and I had turned it into leverage. Now, my name would hang on a wall they could never enter, not because I shouted louder, but because I wrote it down. Because I stayed ready. Because I never signed anything I did not understand. And now, they would read my name every time they walked past the building they once thought I would never be invited into. The article dropped on a Monday morning just as inboxes were filling and meetings were starting, that perfect moment when attention is sharp and people are still pretending to be productive, and within an hour, it was already circulating. It was published by a respected business outlet, not sensationalist, not clickbait, just clean, well-sourced, and quietly devastating. The headline was precise. A former strategist exposes internal misconduct that triggered a wave of executive exits. My name was not in the title, but it did not need to be. Those who needed to know, knew. The writer had done their homework. The article laid out the timeline, the buried report, the clause that slipped through unnoticed, the internal panic that followed its exposure, and the consequences that came like dominoes tipping one by one. It quoted industry analysts, legal experts, and a few anonymous employees who confirmed what leadership had tried to deny. There were no wild accusations, just facts layered with enough restraint to feel like a scalpel instead of a hammer. I read it alone, early, seated at my new desk with the morning light slanting across the floor, coffee in hand. No noise in the background except the low hum of a world that had kept spinning even while mine had been breaking and rebuilding in silence. I scrolled slowly, pausing on the parts that stung, the parts that validated, the parts that made my hands tighten around the cup just slightly. When I finished reading, I did not cry. I did not celebrate. I just breathed, long and deep, the kind of breath that had been stuck in my ribs for months. Colleagues from old jobs started reaching out. Friends sent quiet texts. Former co-workers liked the post that shared the link, though none of them said much more. A few people I barely remembered sent messages that began with "I had no idea," but it was not their idea to have. It had been mine to carry, mine to prove, mine to release. I saw that the CEO had deactivated his social media accounts. I saw one of the company's spokespeople post a vague message about growth sometimes requiring hard lessons. I watched as the board issued another statement filled with cautious optimism, and still, no one said my name. That was fine. I had never done this for recognition. I had done it because someone had to tell the truth. And when no one else would, I did. I closed the article, opened a new document, and began outlining a proposal for my new team, something fresh. Something forward-looking. The past was still there, etched in emails and headlines, but it was no longer weighing me down. Now it was a reference point, a before to the after I had built. And as I typed, I felt something settle into place, not revenge, not justice, but something quieter, a truth that had finally been heard, a story no longer buried, a voice they failed to silence. Days passed, then weeks, and the fallout from the article continued to ripple outward like cracks spreading across glass, quiet but unstoppable, yet through it all, not a single apology ever came. Not from my former manager, who once promised mentorship and loyalty before standing beside HR as they shoved a resignation across the table. Not from the HR director who told me this was the best outcome for everyone involved while avoiding eye contact like I might infect her with the discomfort of her own conscience. Not from my teammates, the ones who watched it happen and said nothing, who stayed quiet in meetings while my projects were reassigned, who closed their laptops when I was escorted out. Silence became their strategy, the one they hoped would protect them from the echo of what they allowed. But even silence has a tone, and theirs rang out louder with every headline, every meeting rescheduled, every investor call that started with an apology they were too afraid to make face-to-face. They updated their profiles, rebranded their language, leaned harder into words like resilience and realignment, never once naming the woman whose work they buried or the letter they signed without reading. I saw them try to scrub their timelines, deleting posts, muting accounts, quietly erasing any evidence that they had once been part of a culture built on dismissal and denial. Still, not one message. Not one call. Not one moment of humility. And I realized they were not sorry because they still did not understand the harm they caused. They thought the damage was in the outcome, not in the everyday erosion that happened long before I ever documented a single fact. The eye rolls, the cut-off sentences, the meetings where I was left off the invite list, the applause for men who repeated my ideas, the slow exclusion they disguised as performance concerns. I had waited once for accountability. I had believed, once, that if you proved yourself enough, someone would do the right thing, but I no longer needed them to name it. I had already done that myself. I had written it, recorded it, signed it into existence. They could try to forget it, but the silence they clung to now was just another kind of confession. One they hoped would fade, and I let them have it. I let them keep their pride, their redacted timelines, their uneasy smiles, because I had something they would never have again, my integrity, my proof, my peace. They had to carry their choices in the quiet. I had already spoken my truth, and the world had listened. The key turned easily in the lock, and when I opened the door to my new office, the air inside smelled like fresh paint and promise, not the stale tension of a place built on fear and performance. The space was bright, sunlight flooding in through wide windows that overlooked the city, the kind of view I used to walk past on my way to a cubicle that never had my name on it, but this one did. It was etched in glass beside the door, my full name in clean letters, followed by the title I had earned not through compliance but through clarity. I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle, the months of silence, the hard drive, the letter they pushed across the table thinking it was the end, and now this. A beginning I built myself. I walked to the desk, ran my hand across the smooth wood, and opened the top drawer where I placed one framed photo, not of my family or my graduation or even my new team, but of the resignation letter. The one they forced me to sign. I had scanned it and printed it in black and white, and below the signature line, I highlighted the sentence they never noticed. By signing this, all attached terms and conditions are acknowledged and accepted. It sat inside the frame, quiet and unassuming, but to me, it was a reminder, not of pain, of power. The power of preparation, of knowing your value when others try to strip it away, of documenting what others dismiss. I hung a simple painting on the wall, a gift from my new team, people who asked what I needed rather than told me what I should be. I unpacked a few books, each one marked with notes and underlines from years of reading in the shadows of louder voices. Now, those same ideas had space to breathe. I sat in the chair and looked out the window, remembering the first time I was told I was too ambitious, too opinionated, too direct. I had believed them once. I had made myself smaller to fit into rooms that were never built for me. But not anymore. This office was not the reward. It was the result of refusing to disappear. of turning a forced exit into a map forward, of turning silence into documentation and fear into motion. I did not need validation from the people who tried to bury me. I had validation in the sunlight on my desk, the plaque on my door, the calm in my chest. I had done it my way, not louder, but clearer. And as I reached for my pen and began writing the first notes for a new initiative, one with my vision at the center, I smiled. They took everything they thought mattered. But they left me with the one thing that would always rebuild itself, me. I visited the framed resignation letter one last time that afternoon, not as a relic of bitterness, but as proof of what they never bothered to notice, and I looked closely at the line printed just above my signature, the one in small, steady font that read, "By signing this, you acknowledge all attached terms and conditions." That sentence had sat there the whole time, invisible to eyes trained only to look for their own convenience, missed by a manager too smug to read past the first paragraph, ignored by an HR rep too eager to wrap things up before the end of the quarter. Beneath that line was my signature, calm and deliberate. Above it were theirs, confident and rushed. I remembered how they had handed me the pen, how my hand did not tremble, how I had smiled ever so slightly when I passed the packet back to them. Not one of them had flipped the page. Not one had checked for the second sheet. That moment, that carelessness, had become the key that opened every door since. It was not about tricking them. It was about documenting what they assumed no one would ever question. I did not hide anything. I did not forge or deceive. I simply wrote the truth and trusted they would skip it. And they did. That clause gave me the right to speak, the right to own my work, the right to tell the story they tried to erase. It protected the report they buried, the data they manipulated, the proof they were willing to destroy to preserve their image. And it reminded me that power does not always come from shouting the loudest. Sometimes it comes from being the one who reads to the end. I took the frame and placed it on a shelf behind my desk, not front and center, but within reach. I wanted it close, not for show, but for grounding. It would sit there quietly as I built something better. A department defined not by hierarchy, but by purpose. A culture shaped by voices that had once been dismissed like mine. I opened my laptop and wrote an email to my new team welcoming them to a project we would build together, signing off with my full name, a name they would see in every meeting, every document, every decision. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city as the light shifted toward evening, soft and golden and calm. They had walked me out thinking they were ending a problem. But they had signed their own accountability without even reading it. The line had always been there, waiting. And I had signed with both hands, not for revenge, for record, for reason, for myself. And now, as the last chapter closed and the real story began, I understood the power of fine print and quiet persistence. They tried to erase me. Instead, they underlined everything I ever was.